Welcome, dear listener, to a story that has echoed through the ages, a tale of love beyond measure and sacrifice beyond understanding. As you settle into the quiet comfort of this evening, let your mind journey back through time to those sacred days in Jerusalem, when heaven touched earth in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking. Close your eyes and let these words carry you to a place where every moment held eternal significance, where every step led toward the greatest act of love the world has ever known. The dusty roads of Judea stretched endlessly under the warm Mediterranean sun, winding through olive groves and terraced hillsides that had witnessed countless pilgrims making their way to the holy city. Jesus walked these familiar paths with his 12 disciples, their sandaled feet following the ancient route that connected the small villages of Galilee to the magnificent temple in Jerusalem. The time of Passover was approaching, and the roads were filled with travelers from every corner of the known world, all converging on the city of David to celebrate the feast that commemorated their ancestors' deliverance from Egypt. The Master's face bore a serene expression, though those who knew him best could detect something deeper in his eyes, a mixture of determination and profound sadness, as if he carried knowledge too heavy for ordinary hearts to bear. He had spoken to his disciples many times about what awaited him in Jerusalem, but they struggled to comprehend his words about suffering and death. How could their beloved teacher, who had healed the sick and raised the dead, speak of his own destruction? As they crested the Mount of Olives, the city of Jerusalem spread before them like a jewel set in golden stone. The temple complex dominated the skyline, its massive walls and gleaming pinnacles catching the afternoon light. Pilgrims' tents dotted the surrounding hills, and the smoke of countless cooking fires rose into the clear sky. The sound of voices speaking in dozens of languages drifted up from the crowded streets below, creating a symphony of human hopes and prayers. "Master," Peter said, his voice filled with awe as he gazed upon the holy city, "look at these magnificent buildings. Surely this is the most beautiful sight in all the world." Jesus paused, his eyes scanning the familiar walls and towers. "Peter," he replied gently, "the time will come when not one stone of these buildings will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." His words carried a weight that seemed to press upon the very air around them, though the disciples could not yet understand their meaning. The small company continued their descent toward Bethphage, where Jesus had arranged to meet certain friends. The olive trees cast long shadows across their path, and the evening breeze carried the scent of wild flowers and fresh grass. In this peaceful moment, it seemed impossible that events of cosmic significance were about to unfold. "Go into the village ahead of you," Jesus instructed 2 of his disciples, his voice calm but purposeful. "As soon as you enter it, you will find a young donkey tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you why you are doing this, say, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here shortly.'" The disciples exchanged glances but did not question their master's unusual request. They had learned long ago that his words, however mysterious they might seem, always proved true. They made their way down the narrow stone path toward the village, their hearts beginning to quicken with anticipation, though they could not name what they were anticipating. The little village of Bethphage nestled quietly in the shadow of the great city, its simple stone houses and narrow streets offering a stark contrast to the grandeur of Jerusalem's walls. Children played in the dusty courtyards while their mothers prepared the evening meal, and the men gathered to discuss the news that filtered down from the capital. Talk in recent days had centered on the teacher from Nazareth, whose miraculous works had stirred both wonder and controversy throughout the land. True to Jesus' words, the disciples found the young donkey exactly where he had said it would be, tied near the doorway of a modest house. The animal was gentle and had never known the weight of a rider upon its back. As they began to untie the rope, The owners appeared, their faces showing curiosity rather than anger. "Why are you untying the donkey?" they asked, just as Jesus had predicted. "The Lord needs it," came the simple reply, and something in those words seemed to satisfy the owners completely. They stepped back and watched as the disciples led the animal away, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than they could understand. When they returned to Jesus with the donkey, word had already begun to spread among the pilgrims camped on the Mount of Olives. The teacher from Galilee was preparing to enter Jerusalem, and something in the air suggested that this would be no ordinary arrival. The disciples threw their cloaks over the donkey's back, creating a simple but dignified covering for their master. As Jesus mounted the humble beast, a profound transformation seemed to occur. The quiet teacher who had walked dusty roads and slept under the stars was revealed as something greater, a king, but not the kind of king the world had ever known. His throne was the back of a borrowed donkey, his crown was the golden light of the setting sun, and his royal procession consisted of fishermen and tax collectors who had left everything to follow him. The first groups of pilgrims to see Jesus began to spread their cloaks on the road before him, creating a carpet of simple garments offered in spontaneous devotion. Others cut branches from the nearby palm trees and olive groves, waving them like banners and spreading them in his path. The action seemed to arise naturally, as if something deep in their hearts recognized the significance of this moment. "Hosanna!" the cry began with just a few voices, but it quickly spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." The sound echoed off the stone walls of the ancient city, rolling through the valleys and up the hillsides where thousands of tents housed pilgrims from across the Roman Empire. Children ran alongside the donkey, their young voices adding to the chorus of praise. Women ululated in the traditional expression of joy, and men raised their staffs and walking sticks in salute. Jesus rode slowly through this outpouring of love and hope, his face reflecting both joy and deep sorrow. He knew what these people expected of him, a political Messiah who would throw off the Roman yoke and restore Israel to its former glory. They could not yet understand that his kingdom was not of this world, that his victory would come through defeat, and his crown would be made of thorns rather than gold. The procession wound its way down the western slope of the Mount of Olives, past ancient tombs carved into the hillside, and through groves where prophets had once walked and prayed. The road curved gently, offering spectacular views of the city walls and the temple complex that dominated the Jerusalem skyline. With each step, more pilgrims joined the celebration, drawn by the infectious joy and the growing sense that they were witnessing history in the making. Some of the Pharisees who had been watching from the sidelines pushed through the crowd, their faces dark with concern and anger. "Teacher," they called to Jesus above the din, "rebuke your disciples. This is blasphemy." Jesus looked at them with eyes full of compassion, even as he shook his head. "I tell you," he replied, his voice somehow audible despite the noise around them, "if they keep quiet, the stones themselves will cry out." As if to prove his words true, the very walls of Jerusalem seemed to echo with the sound of celebration. Birds took flight from the temple walls, adding their voices to the chorus. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, creating a scene of almost supernatural beauty. The procession passed through the eastern gate of the city, and suddenly they were within Jerusalem's ancient walls. The narrow streets amplified the sound of voices and footsteps, creating a thunderous symphony of celebration. Residents peered from windows and rooftops, children darted between the legs of adults to get a better view, and vendors abandoned their stalls to join the growing crowd. "Who is this?" people asked as the procession passed. "Who is this that enters our city with such honor?" "This is Jesus," came the reply from voices throughout the crowd. "The prophet from Nazareth in Galilee, the one who heals the sick and raises the dead, the teacher who speaks with authority." But even as the celebration reached its peak, there were those who watched with different eyes. In the shadows of doorways and from behind curtained windows, the religious leaders observed with growing alarm. This was not how they had planned for the Passover to unfold. This man from Galilee was disrupting their carefully ordered world, and they could see their influence slipping away with every hosanna that filled the air. The procession made its way through the winding streets toward the temple complex, that magnificent structure that had been the center of Jewish religious life for centuries. As they approached the outer courts, the crowd seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. The celebration gradually quieted, replaced by an expectant hush. Jesus dismounted from the donkey and walked slowly toward the temple entrance. His disciples followed, along with hundreds of pilgrims and curious onlookers. The evening sacrifice was still being offered, and the smell of burning incense mixed with the aroma of roasting meat filled the air. Money changers had set up their tables in the outer court, exchanging Roman coins for the temple currency needed to purchase sacrificial animals. Merchants sold doves and lambs to pilgrims who had traveled too far to bring their own offerings. For a moment, Jesus stood quietly at the edge of this scene, his eyes taking in every detail. Then, with sudden purpose, he strode forward and began overturning the tables of the money changers. Coins scattered across the stone floor with a sound like metallic rain, and doves fluttered free from their cages, soaring toward the open sky. "It is written," Jesus declared, his voice ringing through the court, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." The merchants and money changers scrambled to collect their scattered goods, some protesting loudly while others simply fled. But no one dared to challenge this teacher who moved with such authority. There was something in his presence that commanded respect and even fear, as if they were witnessing the righteous anger of heaven itself. The religious leaders who had been watching from a distance now stepped forward, their faces flushed with indignation. "By what authority do you do these things?" they demanded. "Who gave you the right to disrupt our temple?" But before Jesus could answer, something wonderful began to happen. The blind and the lame, who had been relegated to the outer edges of the temple courts, began to approach him. One by one, they came. A man whose eyes had never seen the sun, a woman whose legs had never carried her without pain, children whose bodies bore the marks of disease and deformity. With gentle hands and words of compassion, Jesus healed them all. Sight was restored to clouded eyes, strength flowed into withered limbs, and diseases that had plagued families for generations simply disappeared. The temple courts, so recently filled with the crash of overturned tables and the protest of merchants, now echoed with cries of joy and wonder. "Hosanna to the Son of David!" The children took up the cry again, their innocent voices proclaiming what the learned religious leaders refused to acknowledge. The chief priests and teachers of the law were indignant. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they asked Jesus. "Yes," Jesus replied, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Have you never read, 'From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise'?" As the sun set behind the walls of Jerusalem, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jesus and his disciples made their way back to Bethany, where they would spend the night. The crowds gradually dispersed, but the impact of the day's events continued to ripple through the city like waves on a pond. In homes and shops, in synagogues and marketplaces, people spoke of nothing else. Some spoke with wonder of the miracles they had witnessed. Others argued about the teacher's authority and whether his actions in the temple had been justified. The religious leaders gathered in worried councils, knowing that their grip on power was being challenged in ways they had never experienced before. And in the darkness of a small room somewhere in the city, one of Jesus' own disciples counted silver coins and nursed a growing resentment that would soon bear bitter fruit. The following days passed in a rhythm of teaching and controversy. Each morning, Jesus would return to the temple courts, where crowds gathered to hear his words. He spoke in parables that revealed profound truths to those with ears to hear, while concealing these same truths from those whose hearts were hardened by pride and self-interest. He told them of a landowner who planted a vineyard and entrusted it to tenants, only to have those tenants rebel against him and kill his beloved son. He spoke of a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son, but found that the invited guests were too busy with their own affairs to attend. He described 10 virgins waiting for a bridegroom, 5 wise and 5 foolish, teaching about the importance of being ready for his return. With each parable, the religious leaders felt the sting of truth. They recognized themselves in the rebellious tenants, in the ungrateful guests, in the foolish virgins. Their anger grew daily, but so did their fear of the people who hung on Jesus' every word. They needed a way to arrest him without causing a riot, but such an opportunity seemed impossible to find. Meanwhile, in the upper room of a house owned by a follower of Jesus, preparations were being made for the Passover meal. The disciples had asked their master where they should prepare to eat the traditional feast, and he had given them specific instructions, just as he had done when they needed the donkey for his entrance into Jerusalem. "Go into the city," he had told Peter and John, "and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house he enters and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." Everything had happened exactly as Jesus had predicted. The man with the water jar had been waiting, the room had been prepared, and now the appointed hour was approaching. As the sun began to set on what would be the last day of Jesus' earthly ministry before his passion, the disciples made their final preparations for what they assumed would be a traditional Passover celebration. None of them could have imagined that this meal would become the most significant dinner in human history, or that the simple elements of bread and wine would carry meanings that would echo through eternity. As they climbed the stairs to the upper room, their hearts were filled with anticipation for the feast and the fellowship they would share with their beloved teacher. The room was spacious and comfortable, with cushions arranged around a low table in the traditional manner. Oil lamps cast a warm, flickering light on the stone walls, and the aroma of roasted lamb and fresh bread filled the air. Everything was ready for the celebration of Israel's deliverance from Egypt, but Jesus knew that this night would mark the beginning of an even greater deliverance, not just for Israel, but for all humanity. As the disciples gathered around the table, reclining in the customary fashion, Jesus looked at each face with infinite tenderness. These men had left everything to follow him. They had shared his joys and sorrows, his triumphs and disappointments. They had seen him calm storms and raise the dead, yet they still struggled to understand the true nature of his mission. "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer," Jesus said, his voice heavy with emotion. "For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." The disciples exchanged puzzled glances. Their master had spoken before about suffering, but surely he was speaking symbolically. How could one who wielded such power over disease and death possibly suffer defeat? Jesus took the cup of wine that traditionally began the Passover meal and offered a prayer of thanksgiving. "Take this and divide it among you," he said. "For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." The familiar ritual of the Passover began, but there was something different about this celebration. Jesus' words carried weight and meaning that seemed to transform even the most routine elements of the meal. When he spoke of the lamb whose blood had protected the Israelites in Egypt, his eyes seemed to look beyond time itself. When he mentioned the bread of haste that their ancestors had eaten, his hands lingered over the unleavened loaves with special reverence. Partway through the meal, Jesus did something that shocked his disciples. He rose from the table, removed his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. Then, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, a task normally reserved for the humblest servants. Peter was horrified. "Lord," he protested, "are you going to wash my feet? You do not realize now what I am doing," Jesus replied gently, "but later you will understand." "No," Peter declared emphatically, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus looked at his impetuous disciple with eyes full of love and sadness. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Peter's resistance crumbled immediately. "Then, Lord," he exclaimed, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus smiled at Peter's characteristic enthusiasm. "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." His expression grew serious as his eyes moved around the circle of disciples, pausing briefly on one face that bore a look of growing inner turmoil. When he had finished washing their feet, Jesus put on his clothes and returned to his place at the table. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." The lesson was clear, yet profound in its implications. In a world obsessed with power and position, Jesus had demonstrated a different kind of leadership, one based on service rather than domination, on love rather than fear. His kingdom would be built not by those who sought to be served, but by those who sought to serve others. As the meal continued, Jesus grew increasingly troubled in spirit. The weight of what lay ahead seemed to press upon him more heavily with each passing moment. Finally, he could no longer contain the burden he carried. "Very truly I tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "one of you will betray me." The words fell into the warm atmosphere of the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and dismay through every heart present. The disciples stared at Jesus in disbelief, then at each other with growing suspicion and fear. "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" The question came from several lips almost simultaneously. Each man searched his own heart, wondering if there was something hidden there that could lead to such an unthinkable act. John, who was reclining next to Jesus in the place of honor, leaned back against his master's chest. Peter motioned to him, urging him to ask who the betrayer might be. "Lord, who is it?" John whispered. Jesus dipped a piece of bread into the dish and handed it to Judas Iscariot. "What you're about to do quickly," he said quietly. Judas took the bread, and at that moment, something terrible seemed to enter his heart. The other disciples didn't understand what Jesus meant, assuming perhaps that he was sending Judas to buy something they needed for the feast, or to give money to the poor. But Jesus knew that his disciple was about to fulfill prophecies written centuries before, becoming an unwitting instrument in God's plan of salvation. As Judas rose from the table and walked toward the door, Jesus' eyes followed him with infinite sadness. Here was a man who had been chosen as one of the 12, who had witnessed miracles and heard teachings that would transform the world, yet who was about to commit the most infamous act of betrayal in human history. The tragedy was not just in the act itself, but in the waste of a life that could have known such different glory. The door closed behind Judas with a soft click, and suddenly, the room seemed both larger and more intimate. The remaining 11 disciples drew closer to their master, sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Jesus took bread from the table, and after giving thanks, he broke it into pieces. "Take and eat," he said, offering it to his disciples. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The simple words carried weight far beyond their surface meaning. This was no longer just the unleavened bread of the Passover, commemorating Israel's hasty flight from Egypt. This was something entirely new, yet connected to everything that had come before. In this bread, the sacrifice of every lamb that had ever been offered in the temple found its ultimate fulfillment. After they had eaten, Jesus took the cup of wine and offered another prayer of thanksgiving. "Drink from it, all of you," he said. "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples drank, not fully understanding but sensing that they were participating in something that would echo through all eternity. This was no longer just wine celebrating the joy of deliverance. This was the blood of a new covenant, sealing a relationship between God and humanity that would never be broken. As they sat in the flickering lamplight, Jesus began to speak to them about things they had never heard before. He told them about his Father's house with many rooms and about how he was going to prepare a place for them there. He spoke of sending another counselor who would be with them always, guiding them into all truth and reminding them of everything he had taught them. "Do not let your hearts be troubled," he urged them, seeing the fear and confusion in their eyes. "You believe in God, believe also in me. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Philip, always the practical one, spoke up. "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Jesus looked at him with patient love. "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father, and that the Father is in me?" The words were simple, yet they revealed truth so profound that the disciples could only begin to grasp their meaning. Their teacher was claiming to be not just a messenger from God, but God himself walking among them in human form. It was a claim that would either mark him as the greatest deceiver in history or as the one for whom all creation had been waiting. As the night wore on, Jesus continued to teach them, his words growing more urgent as he sensed his time with them drawing to a close. He spoke of the vine and the branches, illustrating how they must remain connected to him if they wished to bear fruit. He warned them about persecution and hatred they would face from a world that had rejected him. He promised them joy that no one could take away and peace that surpassed all understanding. "I have told you these things," he said, "so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." Then Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven and began to pray, not just for himself, but for his disciples and for all who would believe in him through their message. His words were intimate yet majestic, revealing the eternal relationship between Father and Son that had existed before the world began. "Father, the hour has come," he prayed. "Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. For you granted him authority over all people that he might give eternal life to all those you have given him. And this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." He prayed for the disciples' protection and unity, knowing the challenges they would face after his departure. He prayed for their sanctification through truth and for the effectiveness of their future ministry. Most remarkably, he prayed for those who had not yet believed but would come to faith through the disciples' testimony. "My prayer is not for them alone," he said. "I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." The prayer revealed the scope of God's love, not limited to the 12 men in that upper room, but extending to every person who would ever live, including those who would hear these words in centuries yet to come. The meal that had begun as a celebration of Israel's past deliverance had become the inauguration of humanity's eternal freedom. When the prayer ended, they sang a hymn together, their voices joining in the ancient words that had comforted generations of God's people. Then they rose from the table and prepared to leave the upper room. The Passover meal was complete, but the greatest Passover of all was just beginning. They made their way down the stairs and out into the cool Jerusalem night. The city was quieter now, though lights still flickered in windows where families were concluding their own Passover celebrations. The full moon hung overhead, casting silver shadows on the narrow stone streets as they walked eastward toward the Mount of Olives. As they crossed the Kidron Valley, Jesus continued to teach them, his voice gentle in the darkness. He spoke of the coming of the Spirit who would guide them after his departure. He warned Peter that Satan had asked to sift him like wheat, but assured him that his faith would not fail and that he would strengthen his brothers after his restoration. "Lord," Peter protested, "I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." Jesus looked at his devoted but impetuous disciple with eyes full of foreknowledge and compassion. "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me." The prediction hung in the night air like a sword over Peter's head, though he could not believe such a thing was possible. How could he, who had walked on water at Jesus' command and had been the first to declare him the Christ, ever deny his beloved Master? They climbed the familiar path up the Mount of Olives, past ancient olive trees whose gnarled trunks spoke of centuries spent watching over the holy city. At the bottom of the mount lay a garden called Gethsemane, a place where Jesus often came to pray, and where the disciples expected to spend the night as they had done many times before. But as they entered the garden, Jesus' demeanor changed dramatically. The peace and authority he had displayed during the supper gave way to visible anguish. His face, which had been serene even while speaking of his coming death, now showed signs of an inner struggle too intense for mortal minds to fully comprehend. "Sit here while I go over there and pray," he told 8 of the disciples, positioning them near the garden's entrance. Then he took Peter, James, and John deeper into the olive grove, to a secluded spot where he often came when he needed solitude with his Father. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he confided to these 3 closest friends. "Stay here and keep watch with me." The 3 disciples had never seen their Master in such distress. This was the man who had calmed storms with a word and raised the dead with a command, yet now he seemed to be wrestling with forces that threatened to crush his very spirit. They wanted to comfort him, but they sensed that this was a battle he had to fight alone. Jesus went a little farther and fell face down on the ground, his whole body trembling with the intensity of his prayer. "My Father," he cried out, "if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." The cup he spoke of was not made of gold or silver, but contained suffering beyond human imagination. It held not just the physical agony of crucifixion, but the spiritual torment of bearing the sins of the entire world. It meant experiencing the wrath of God against sin, and for the first time in eternal existence, facing separation from the Father with whom he had shared perfect communion since before time began. The weight of this cosmic burden pressed down upon him until his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Every sin that had ever been committed or ever would be committed seemed to concentrate itself upon his innocent soul. The lies and murders, the hatred and betrayal, the pride and selfishness of countless generations, all of it was gathering into a single moment of reckoning. When he returned to his 3 disciples, he found them sleeping, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the evening and unable to grasp the significance of what was happening. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter gently. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He returned to his place of prayer, and again the battle raged within his soul. "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." The surrender was complete, yet the agony continued. An angel appeared from heaven to strengthen him, but the struggle between his human nature and the divine plan continued with undiminished intensity. A second time, he returned to find his disciples sleeping, their eyes heavy with weariness they could not overcome. They wanted to stay awake to support their master in his hour of need, but their bodies betrayed their intentions. Jesus said nothing this time, understanding their weakness even as he faced his ultimate test alone. The third period of prayer brought the final resolution. The Son of Man who had come to seek and save the lost accepted fully and completely the mission that would cost him everything. The cup would not pass. He would drink it to the dregs. In doing so, he would transform the bitter wine of divine justice into the sweet wine of mercy that would flow freely to all who believed. When he returned to his disciples for the third time, his demeanor had changed again. The anguish was still there, but it was now accompanied by a resolute determination. The battle had been won, not through escape, but through surrender, not by avoiding the cross, but by embracing it. "Are you still sleeping and resting?" he asked his disciples, though there was no rebuke in his voice, only the sadness of one who had hoped for companionship in his darkest hour. "Look, the hour is come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Even as he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps could be heard through the olive trees. Torches flickered in the distance, and the glint of steel caught the moonlight. A crowd was approaching, armed with swords and clubs, led by someone the disciples would recognize with shock and horror. Judas Iscariot emerged from the darkness, his face a mask of determination that barely concealed the torment in his eyes. Behind him came a mixed multitude: temple guards, Roman soldiers, servants of the high priest, and curious onlookers who had been roused from their sleep by the unusual activity in the city. The betrayer had arranged a signal with those who had hired him. "The one I kiss is the man," he had told them. "Arrest him and lead him away under guard." It was a cruel irony that the traditional greeting of friendship would be used to identify the victim for his enemies. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said as he approached Jesus, his voice artificially cheerful. He leaned forward and kissed Jesus on the cheek, the kiss lingering just long enough to ensure that the guards knew their target. "Do what you came for, friend," Jesus replied quietly. The word friend was not spoken in anger, but in sorrow, as if even in this moment of betrayal, he was offering Judas one last opportunity for repentance. The soldiers and guards moved forward to arrest Jesus, but he stepped toward them before they could lay hands on him. "Who is it you want?" he asked. "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said simply. At those words, the same words by which God had revealed himself to Moses at the burning bush, something extraordinary happened. The entire crowd fell backward to the ground as if struck by an invisible force. For a moment, the garden was filled with the sounds of men scrambling to regain their footing, their weapons clattering on the stone ground. It was a demonstration of the power that Jesus could have wielded if he had chosen to do so. He could have spoken a word and scattered his enemies like leaves before the wind. He could have called down legions of angels to defend him. But he chose instead to surrender to their weak hands, allowing them to do what they could never have accomplished without his permission. "Who is it you want?" he asked again as they stood up, his voice steady and unafraid. "Jesus of Nazareth," they repeated, still shaken by what they had experienced. "I told you that I am he," Jesus said. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." Even in the moment of his arrest, his first concern was for the safety of his disciples, fulfilling his promise that none of those the Father had given him would be lost. Peter, suddenly awakening from his confusion and fear, drew a sword and struck at the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. The man cried out in pain, and blood began to flow down the side of his head. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus commanded Peter firmly, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" With infinite compassion, Jesus touched the injured man's ear, and it was immediately healed. Even his enemies were the recipients of his mercy, even as they came to arrest him with violence and treachery. The irony of the situation was not lost on Jesus. "Am I leading a rebellion," he asked the crowd, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." It was true. For days he had been openly teaching in the temple, surrounded by crowds who hung on his every word. They could have arrested him then, but they had been afraid of the people's reaction. Now, under cover of darkness and with the help of a betrayer, they finally felt safe to make their move. The temple guards bound Jesus' hands, and the procession began to move back toward the city. The disciples, overcome with terror and confusion, scattered into the darkness as Jesus had predicted. Only Peter and John followed at a distance, their hearts torn between loyalty and fear, love and self-preservation. As they walked through the Kidron Valley and up toward Jerusalem's walls, Jesus moved with quiet dignity despite his bonds. The soldiers and temple guards who surrounded him seemed almost embarrassed by their task, avoiding his eyes as if his very presence condemned their actions. The torches they carried created dancing shadows on the ancient stones, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls of sleeping houses. The procession first made its way to the house of Annas, the former high priest whose influence still dominated the religious establishment of Jerusalem. Though he no longer held the official title, Annas remained the power behind the temple hierarchy, and his sons and sons-in-law occupied the most important positions in the religious establishment. It was natural that they would bring Jesus to him first, seeking his guidance on how to proceed. The house of Annas was one of the finest in Jerusalem, built of pale limestone and decorated with intricate carvings that spoke of wealth and status. Servants hurried about with oil lamps, awakened by the unusual nighttime activity. In the courtyard, a fire had been kindled to ward off the chill of the night air, and various members of the arresting party gathered around it to warm themselves. Peter had managed to gain entrance to the courtyard, perhaps because John was known to the high priest's household. He stood near the fire, trying to blend in with the servants and guards while keeping watch over his master's fate. The flickering flames cast uncertain light on his face, and he pulled his cloak closer around him as if it could hide his identity. Inside the house, Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching, seeking some grounds for accusation. His voice was smooth and cultured, but there was steel beneath the silk. This was a man accustomed to power, to having his will obeyed without question. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied with calm dignity. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." The answer was perfectly reasonable, but it frustrated Annas, who had hoped to trap Jesus into saying something that could be used against him. One of the officials standing nearby struck Jesus in the face, his hand making a sharp crack against flesh. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" the man demanded angrily. Jesus turned to look at his attacker with eyes that held no hatred, only sadness. "If I said something wrong, he replied quietly. "Testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" The simple question hung in the air, and the official found himself unable to answer. There had been nothing wrong with Jesus' response, nothing that warranted violence. The blow had been struck in frustration and anger, not in the service of justice. Realizing that he would learn nothing useful from Jesus, Annas decided to send him to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, who held the official position of high priest. The bonds remained on Jesus' hands as he was led through the streets to another grand house not far away. Meanwhile, Peter remained in the courtyard, his heart pounding with fear and anxiety. As he stood near the fire, a servant girl looked at him closely, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face in the flickering light. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. Peter felt his blood run cold. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said quickly, moving away from the fire toward the entrance of the courtyard. Just then, a rooster crowed in the distance, its call echoing across the sleeping city. But Peter was too focused on his fear to remember his master's prediction. The house of Caiaphas was even grander than that of his father-in-law, befitting his position as the official head of the Jewish religious establishment. Members of the Sanhedrin had been hastily summoned from their beds, and they gathered in the judgment hall with sleep still heavy in their eyes, but determination filling their hearts. They had been planning this moment for months, and now their opportunity had finally arrived. Caiaphas was a practical man who understood the political realities of Roman rule. He knew that any threat to the peace could result in harsh retaliation from their occupiers, and he saw Jesus as exactly such a threat. Better that one man should die than that the entire nation should suffer, he had reasoned. It was a cold calculation, but one that made sense from his perspective. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice from the very beginning. According to Jewish law, capital cases could not be tried at night. Witnesses had to be carefully examined, and the accused had the right to defend himself. But these were desperate times, and desperate men were willing to bend any rules that stood in their way. Witness after witness was brought forward, but their testimonies contradicted each other so obviously that even the biased court could not accept them. Some claimed that Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple, others that he had proclaimed himself a king, still others that he had practiced sorcery. But none of their stories aligned, and it became clear that they were speaking from malice rather than truth. Jesus remained silent through most of these false accusations, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the growing frustration of his accusers. His very silence seemed to condemn the proceedings, making it obvious to anyone with eyes to see that this was not a trial, but a predetermined execution. Finally, Caiaphas rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "Are you not going to answer?" he demanded. "What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" Still, Jesus remained silent, knowing that no defense would be accepted by these men who had already decided his fate. Caiaphas tried a different approach, invoking the most sacred oath known to Jewish law. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over Jesus' head. To answer truthfully would provide the grounds for conviction they sought. To remain silent would be to deny his identity and mission. But Jesus had not come this far to turn back now. "You have said so," Jesus replied, his voice clear and strong. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The words were taken directly from the prophecy of Daniel, and every man in that room knew their significance. Jesus was not merely claiming to be the Messiah, he was claiming to be the divine Son who would return in glory to judge the earth. It was either the truth that would transform the world or the most audacious blasphemy ever uttered. Caiaphas tore his robes in the traditional expression of horror at blasphemy. "He has spoken blasphemy," he declared. "Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," came the response from around the room, though not every voice joined in the condemnation. What followed was a scene that would haunt the memories of those present for the rest of their lives. The guards and servants, emboldened by the court's verdict, began to mock and abuse the man they had condemned. They spat in his face and struck him with their fists. They blindfolded him and demanded that he prophesy who had hit him, their laughter echoing through the judgment hall. Through it all, Jesus endured with a patience that seemed almost superhuman. He who could have called down fire from heaven to consume his tormentors chose instead to absorb their hatred and violence, storing up each blow as evidence of humanity's desperate need for salvation. Outside in the courtyard, Peter faced his own moment of testing. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, more people had gathered around the fire, and the servant girl who had first questioned him spoke up again. "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth," she announced to the group. Peter's denial was stronger this time, accompanied by an oath. "I don't know the man," he declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. A little later, another servant approached him, studying his face carefully. "Surely you are one of them," the man said. "Your accent gives you away." Peter began to call down curses on himself, swearing with the coarsest language he knew. "I don't know the man," he repeated, his voice now shrill with fear. Immediately, a rooster crowed for the second time, its call cutting through the dawn air like a knife. At that very moment, Jesus was being led across the courtyard, and he turned to look directly at Peter. Their eyes met for just an instant, but in that brief glance, Peter saw not condemnation, but infinite love and sorrow. The memory of Jesus' prediction rushed back into Peter's mind with crushing force. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." He had done exactly what his master had foretold, despite all his protestations of loyalty and courage. Peter fled from the courtyard, and when he reached a place where he could be alone, he wept bitterly. The tears came from the depths of his soul, born not just of shame, but of the realization that he had failed the one person who had believed in him when no one else would. Yet, even in his despair, he could not have imagined that this failure would become the foundation for a restoration more beautiful than his original calling. Meanwhile, Jesus was being prepared for the next phase of his ordeal. The Jewish leaders had secured the religious conviction they needed, but under Roman law, they could not carry out an execution without the approval of the Roman governor. Pontius Pilate would have to be convinced that this Galilean teacher posed a threat to Roman rule. As the sun rose over Jerusalem on what would become known as Good Friday, the city was already stirring with the activities of the Passover season. Pilgrims were making their way to the temple for the morning sacrifice. Vendors were setting up their stalls in the marketplaces, and the aroma of baking bread filled the air. It seemed impossible that such ordinary activities could continue while the Son of God was being led to his death. Yet the world continued to turn as if nothing extraordinary was happening. The procession that made its way from Caiaphas's house to the Praetorium, Pilate's official residence, was carefully orchestrated. The religious leaders wanted to present a united front to the Roman governor, showing that all of Jewish leadership was in agreement about the threat this man posed. They had coached their witnesses and prepared their arguments, knowing that Pilate would not be swayed by religious concerns, but would need to be convinced of political necessity. Pontius Pilate was not a man who relished early morning interruptions, especially during religious festivals when tensions in the city always ran high. He had been governor of Judea for several years, long enough to understand the complex dynamics of Jewish politics, but not long enough to feel completely comfortable with them. His primary concern was maintaining order and collecting taxes for Rome. Everything else was secondary. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful observers that the Jewish leaders, who claimed to be so concerned about religious purity, refused to enter the praetorium because it would defile them for the Passover celebration. They stood outside while their prisoner was brought inside, their scruples about ceremonial cleanliness intact, even as they orchestrated the murder of an innocent man. "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Pilate asked, his voice betraying his irritation at being awakened so early. "If he were not a criminal," they replied evasively, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate was too experienced to be satisfied with such a vague answer. "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law," he said dismissively. "But we have no right to execute anyone," they protested, revealing the true purpose of their visit. So they were forced to present specific charges that would concern a Roman governor. "We have found this man subverting our nation," they declared. "He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." These were serious accusations if they were true, but Pilate was skilled at reading men's motives, and something about this situation troubled him. The prisoner standing before him looked nothing like a revolutionary. His clothes were simple, his manner calm, and his eyes held a depth that spoke of wisdom rather than rebellion. Pilate went back inside the praetorium and summoned Jesus for a private interview. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked directly. "Is that your own idea?" Jesus replied. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate responded with some irritation. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus looked at this representative of the world's greatest empire with compassion. "My kingdom is not of this world," he said quietly. "If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king, then," Pilate said, seizing on what seemed like an admission. "You say that I am a king," Jesus replied. "In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Pilate stared at this strange prisoner who spoke of truth as if it were something concrete and knowable. "What is truth?" he asked, but he didn't wait for an answer. The question had haunted philosophers for centuries, and he didn't expect to solve it in a Jerusalem courtroom. Going back outside to the waiting crowd, Pilate announced his verdict. "I find no basis for a charge against this man." The response was immediate and vociferous. "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching," they shouted. "He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." The mention of Galilee gave Pilate an idea for extricating himself from this unwelcome situation. Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, was in Jerusalem for the Passover. Since Jesus was technically his subject, perhaps Herod could deal with this problem. So Jesus was sent to yet another trial, this time before the man who had executed John the Baptist and who had been wanting to meet the famous teacher from Nazareth. Herod's interest was curiosity rather than justice. He hoped to see Jesus perform some miracle for his entertainment. But Jesus remained completely silent throughout Herod's questioning, refusing to satisfy the tetrarch's morbid curiosity. His silence frustrated Herod, who finally gave up and sent him back to Pilate after allowing his soldiers to mock and abuse the prisoner. They dressed him in an elegant robe, making fun of his supposed royal claims, then returned him to the Roman governor. When Jesus appeared before Pilate for the second time that morning, the governor was even more troubled than before. His wife had sent him a message warning him to have nothing to do with that innocent man because she had suffered greatly in a dream about him. Pilate was not normally a superstitious man, but something about this case was making him increasingly uncomfortable. "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion," Pilate announced to the crowd. "I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." It was a compromise that satisfied no one. The Jewish leaders wanted Jesus dead, not merely punished. And the punishment Pilate had in mind, scourging, was a brutal ordeal that few men survived intact. The Roman soldiers led Jesus into the courtyard of the praetorium, where a whipping post stood waiting. They stripped him of his clothes and bound his hands above his head, stretching his body taut. The scourge they used was a fearsome instrument of torture, consisting of leather thongs embedded with pieces of metal and bone designed to tear flesh from the victim's back. The beating that followed was savage beyond description. Each stroke of the scourge opened new wounds and deepened old ones, until Jesus' back was a mass of torn flesh and flowing blood. The soldiers took turns, counting out the strokes with mechanical precision, their faces showing no emotion as they systematically destroyed the body of the man they had been ordered to punish. But their cruelty did not end with the scourging. Hearing that this man claimed to be a king, they decided to mock his supposed royalty. They threw a purple robe over his bleeding shoulders and twisted together a crown of thorns, pressing it down onto his head until the sharp spines drew blood from his scalp. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they jeered, taking turns slapping his face and spitting on him. They knelt before him in mock worship, then struck him with a staff they had placed in his hand as a scepter. The irony was profound in their mockery. They were actually acknowledging the truth they could not recognize. When they tired of their sport, Pilate brought Jesus out to show him to the crowd. The governor perhaps hoped that the sight of this tortured man would satisfy their bloodlust and allow him to release the prisoner. Jesus stood on the steps of the praetorium, barely recognizable as human, blood flowing from dozens of wounds, the purple robe clinging to his lacerated back. "Here's the man," Pilate announced, his voice carrying a mixture of disgust and pity. But the sight of Jesus' suffering only inflamed the crowd further. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" they shouted, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the courtyard. "You take him and crucify him," Pilate shot back, his frustration finally boiling over. "As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders played their final card. "We have a law," they declared, "and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." This accusation terrified Pilate even more than the political charges had. Romans were deeply superstitious about the gods, and the possibility that he might be condemning a divine being filled him with dread. He took Jesus back inside for another private interview. "Where do you come from?" he asked urgently. But Jesus gave him no answer. The time for explanation was past. The hour of sacrifice had arrived. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus looked at this powerful man with infinite compassion. "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above," he said quietly. "So therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Pilate made several more attempts to release Jesus, but the crowd's demands grew more threatening. "If you let this man go," they shouted, "you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." The threat was clear and effective. Pilate's position as governor depended on maintaining Caesar's favor, and he could not afford to be accused of tolerating rebellion. Political expedience won out over justice, as it had so many times before and would so many times again. Pilate brought Jesus out to the judgment seat one final time. "Here is your king," he announced with bitter irony. "Take him away, take him away, crucify him," the crowd roared. "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest replied, unknowingly renouncing centuries of Jewish independence and history. Finally, Pilate called for a basin of water and washed his hands before the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "It is your responsibility." "His blood is on us and on our children," The crowd responded, accepting a guilt that would haunt generations. The formalities of Roman law were quickly completed. The death warrant was signed, and Jesus was handed over to the soldiers for execution. The governor retreated to his residence, perhaps hoping to forget the morning's events, but the memory of those penetrating eyes would follow him for the rest of his life. In another part of the city, Judas Iscariot was learning the bitter truth about the consequences of betrayal. The silver coins that had seemed so important the night before now felt like burning coals in his hands. The religious leaders who had been so eager to pay him now wanted nothing to do with him, dismissing him with cold indifference now that his usefulness was ended. "I have sinned," he confessed to them, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" "Arver," they replied callously, "that's your responsibility." Judas threw the silver coins onto the temple floor and fled, the sound of the money clattering on stone echoing through the sacred halls. He could not live with what he had done, and he found a lonely place where he ended his own life, adding one more tragedy to the day's catalogue of sorrows. The chief priests picked up the silver coins, but they faced a problem. This was blood money, and it could not be put into the temple treasury. In the end, they used it to buy a field for burying foreigners, fulfilling another ancient prophecy without realizing what they were doing. Meanwhile, Jesus was being prepared for the final act of the drama. The Roman soldiers were efficient in their brutality, having carried out countless executions over the years. They knew exactly what needed to be done and wasted no time in doing it. First, they fashioned a cross from rough timber, the horizontal beam heavy enough to test the strength of even a healthy man. This cross beam would be carried by the condemned man to the place of execution, while the vertical post waited at the crucifixion site. They stripped Jesus of the purple robe and dressed him again in his own clothes, though the simple garments were now stained with blood from his wounds. The crown of thorns remained on his head, its sharp points continuing to draw blood from his scalp. The crossbeam was placed across his shoulders, its weight pressing down on the wounds left by the scourging. Every step would be agony, every breath a struggle, but this was part of the punishment. The condemned man must participate in his own execution. The procession to Golgotha began with the sound of a trumpet, announcing to the city that another execution was taking place. This was meant to serve as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging Roman authority. The soldiers formed a square around Jesus, their spears ready to prevent any rescue attempt. A crowd gathered to watch the spectacle, some drawn by morbid curiosity, others by genuine grief for the man they had seen heal the sick and comfort the afflicted. Among the watchers were women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, their faces streaked with tears as they witnessed the destruction of the one who had brought such hope into their lives. The narrow streets of Jerusalem were crowded with Passover pilgrims, many of whom had heard of the famous teacher from Nazareth. Some watched in shocked silence, unable to believe that this broken figure was the same man who had entered the city in triumph just days before. Others joined in the mockery, shouting insults and taunts at the condemned man. Jesus struggled under the weight of the cross, his strength sapped by the loss of blood and the trauma of the night's ordeal. Several times he stumbled and fell, the rough wood scraping against his wounded back, his knees striking the stone pavement. Each time, the soldiers forced him to his feet and compelled him to continue. Finally, the soldiers realized that Jesus might not survive the journey to Golgotha if he continued to carry the cross himself. They needed him alive for the crucifixion, so they looked around for someone to help. Their eyes fell on a man named Simon, who had come to Jerusalem from Cyrene in North Africa for the Passover celebration. Simon was probably trying to stay out of trouble, keeping his head down and avoiding attention as he made his way through the crowded streets. But the soldiers seized him and forced him to carry the crossbeam for Jesus. It was a humiliating task, one that marked him as being associated with a condemned criminal. but he had no choice in the matter. As they walked together toward the place of execution, Simon found himself looking into the face of the man he was helping. What he saw there was not the hatred or despair he might have expected, but something that would change his life forever. Years later, Simon's sons would become prominent members of the early Christian church, their faith rooted in their father's encounter with Jesus on the road to Golgotha. The procession continued through the city gates and up a small hill outside the walls. Golgotha, which meant the place of the skull, was where Rome carried out its executions. The location was chosen deliberately visible from the city walls, but outside the sacred precincts, a place where the gruesome business of imperial justice could be conducted without defiling the holy places. As they climbed the hill, Jesus turned to address the women who were following and mourning for him. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he said, his voice weak but still carrying compassion, "do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" His words were prophetic, looking forward to the destruction that would come upon Jerusalem within a generation. But they were also words of comfort, showing that even in his agony, his thoughts were for others rather than himself. 2 other men were being crucified that day, criminals who had been condemned for insurrection and robbery. They stumbled along behind Jesus, their own crosses weighing them down, their faces showing the desperation of men who knew their time had come. At the top of Golgotha, the soldiers began their grim work with practiced efficiency. The upright posts were already in place, dark with the stains of previous executions. The crossbeams were positioned, and the condemned men were forced to lie down upon them. What followed was a scene of horror that would be remembered as long as human beings told stories. The soldiers drove nails through Jesus' wrists and feet, the iron spikes piercing flesh and bone with sickening finality. His cries of pain echoed across the hill, but he did not curse his executioners or call down divine vengeance upon them. Instead, as the cross was raised and dropped into its socket with a jarring thud that sent waves of agony through his entire body, Jesus spoke words that no one expected. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The prayer was not just for the soldiers who had driven the nails, but for all who had participated in this cosmic miscarriage of justice. It was forgiveness offered to the very people who were in the process of murdering him, a demonstration of love so radical that it defied all human understanding. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign to be posted in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, so that all could read it: "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests had protested, wanting it to read, "This man claimed to be King of the Jews," but Pilate had refused to change it. "What I have written, he had declared, perhaps finding one small way to assert his authority in a situation where he had felt powerless. As Jesus hung between heaven and earth, various groups gathered around the cross to watch his final hours. The soldiers sat down to keep watch, dividing his clothes among themselves, as was their custom. When they came to his undergarment, which was woven in one piece from top to bottom, they decided not to tear it, but to cast lots for it, unknowingly fulfilling ancient prophecy. The religious leaders who had orchestrated his death came to gloat over their victory. "He saved others," they mocked, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Even the criminals crucified with him joined in the abuse, though one of them would soon have a change of heart that would echo through eternity. "Aren't you the Messiah?" one of them sneered. "Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked his companion. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus with what might have been the first prayer of his life. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." The response came immediately, cutting through the sounds of mockery and the groans of dying men. "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was a promise that transformed a scene of ultimate hopelessness into one of ultimate hope. This thief, who had lived a life of crime and was dying in disgrace, became the first person to enter heaven through the sacrifice being made on the cross beside him. Among those watching from a distance were several women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. They stood there helplessly, their hearts breaking as they watched the one they loved suffer and die. Chief among them was Mary, his mother, who had pondered in her heart the angel's announcement 33 years before, and who now watched that promised child die as a condemned criminal. Near the cross also stood John, the beloved disciple, his young face streaked with tears as he watched his master's agony. It was to John that Jesus entrusted the care of his mother in one of his most tender acts from the cross. "Woman, here is your son," he said to Mary, then to John, "Here is your mother." From that moment, John took Mary into his home, caring for her as if she were his own mother. It was a beautiful example of how the family of faith transcends biological relationships, creating bonds of love that endure beyond death itself. As the hours passed, and strange darkness began to settle over the land, though it was only midday, the sun seemed to withdraw its light, as if creation itself could not bear to witness what was happening on that hill outside Jerusalem. The darkness lasted for 3 hours, creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread that affected everyone present. During this time of darkness, a cosmic battle was being fought that no human eye could see. The sins of the world were being placed upon the innocent Son of God, and he was experiencing the wrath of divine justice that those sins deserved. For the first time in eternity, the perfect communion between Father and Son was broken as Jesus became sin for humanity's sake. Near the end of the 3 hours of darkness, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The words were taken from Psalm 22, and those who heard them might have recognized the reference. But they expressed a real anguish, the agony of one who had never known separation from God, experiencing the full weight of divine abandonment. Some of the bystanders misunderstood, thinking he was calling for Elijah. "Listen, he's calling Elijah," they said. One of them ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone," the man said. "Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." As his physical strength ebbed away, Jesus spoke again. "I am thirsty." It was a simple human need, the cry of a man whose body was shutting down after hours of unimaginable suffering. Someone lifted a sponge soaked in sour wine to his lips, and he drank a little. Then, with a voice that somehow carried strength despite his weakness, Jesus made a declaration that would echo through history. "It is finished." With those words, he announced the completion of his mission. The debt of human sin had been paid in full. The way to God had been opened. The work of salvation was complete. No more sacrifice would ever be needed. No more price would ever have to be paid. Having said this, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit, choosing the moment of his death as he had chosen every other aspect of his sacrifice. At that moment, the earth shook violently, rocks split apart, and tombs broke open. In the temple, the massive curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom, symbolizing that the way into God's presence was now open to all who would come through faith. The centurion who had supervised the crucifixion was deeply moved by what he had witnessed. This was a man who had probably overseen hundreds of executions, but he had never seen anyone die like this. "Surely this man was the Son of God," he declared, his words carrying across the hill where 3 crosses stood against the darkening sky. Many of the crowd who had come to watch the spectacle went away beating their breasts in grief and horror, finally realizing what they had witnessed. But the disciples and the women who had loved Jesus stood at a distance, their hearts broken, but their vigil faithful to the end. Because it was the day of preparation before the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken so they would die quickly and their bodies could be removed before the holy day began. Breaking the legs would prevent the condemned from pushing themselves up to breathe, hastening death by asphyxiation. The soldiers came and broke the legs of the 2 criminals, but when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead. To make sure, one of them pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out, evidence that his heart had literally burst from the strain of his suffering. These details were recorded by eyewitnesses who understood their significance. The fact that Jesus' legs were not broken fulfilled the prophecy that not one of his bones would be broken, while the piercing of his side fulfilled another ancient prediction. As evening approached, a man named Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate to ask for Jesus' body. Joseph was a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had secretly believed in Jesus but had been afraid to speak publicly. Now, in this darkest hour, he found the courage to identify himself with the crucified teacher. Pilate was surprised that Jesus had died so quickly, but after confirming the death with the centurion, he granted Joseph's request. Nicodemus, another secret follower who had once come to Jesus by night, joined Joseph in this act of devotion, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 75 pounds, a royal burial for the king who had been crowned with thorns. Together, these 2 unlikely disciples tenderly removed Jesus' body from the cross. They wrapped it in strips of linen cloth with the spices, according to Jewish burial customs, their hands trembling as they performed this final act of love for their teacher. The body that had been so brutally tortured now received the gentle care it deserved, though it came too late to ease any suffering. Near the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden was a new tomb that Joseph had recently cut out of rock for his own eventual use. Since it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there, rolling a large stone across the entrance to seal it shut. The sound of that stone settling into place seemed to echo with an air of finality, as if all hope was being entombed along with the body. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, sat opposite the tomb, watching where Jesus was laid. Their vigil was quiet but faithful, these women who had followed him in life now keeping watch over his death. As the sun set and the Sabbath began, they reluctantly departed, planning to return after the holy day to complete the burial preparations with additional spices and perfumes. The chief priests and Pharisees, meanwhile, were taking no chances. The next day, they went to Pilate with another request. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate, perhaps weary of the whole affair, granted their request. "Take a guard," he told them. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting Roman guards to watch over it. These soldiers were professionals, men whose lives depended on their vigilance. The penalty for sleeping on duty or allowing a prisoner to escape was death, so they could be trusted to maintain their watch with absolute dedication. As the Sabbath hours passed in Jerusalem, an extraordinary quiet settled over the city. The Passover celebrations continued in homes throughout the area, but there was an underlying sense that something fundamental had changed. Those who had known Jesus personally found themselves struggling with grief and confusion, while his enemies felt a grim satisfaction at having eliminated what they saw as a threat to their authority. The disciples had scattered after Jesus' arrest, and now they huddled together in hiding, afraid that they too might be arrested and executed. Their dreams of a restored kingdom of Israel had died on the cross with their master, and they saw no future beyond mere survival. Peter's denials had left him broken and ashamed, while the others wrestled with their own failures and fears. Yet, in the supernatural realm, forces were at work that no human eye could perceive. The death of Jesus had not been a defeat, but a victory. Not an ending, but a new beginning. The price for human sin had been paid in full, the power of death had been broken, and the gates of heaven had been thrown open wide. All that remained was for this cosmic triumph to be revealed to the world. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene made her way to the tomb. She had spent the Sabbath in restless waiting, her heart heavy with grief, but her devotion unwavering. She carried spices to complete the burial preparations, though she wondered how she would manage to roll away the heavy stone that sealed the entrance. As she approached the garden, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern hills. But as she drew nearer to the tomb, she saw something that made her heart skip with alarm. The stone had been rolled away from the entrance, and the tomb stood open like a mouth gaping in the morning light. Her first thought was that someone had stolen the body, and she turned and ran back toward the city as fast as her feet could carry her. The spices scattered behind her as she fled, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Who would have done such a thing, and why? She found Peter and John and gasped out her news. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." The two disciples immediately ran toward the tomb, John outrunning Peter and arriving first. He bent down and looked in, seeing the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go inside. When Peter arrived, breathless and anxious, he went straight into the tomb. What they saw there was puzzling and wonderful. The burial cloths were lying in perfect order, as if the body had simply passed through them. The cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head was folded up by itself, separate from the other cloths. It was not the scene of a grave robbery, where thieves would have unwrapped the body hurriedly and left the cloths in disarray. This was something else entirely. John also went inside, and when he saw the evidence, he believed. Though they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead, the physical evidence before them pointed to only one conclusion. Somehow, impossibly, Jesus had come back to life. The disciples returned to their homes, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had seen. But Mary Magdalene remained at the tomb, weeping. She had lost not only her Lord, but now even his body, and her grief seemed beyond consolation. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb once more, and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. Their presence should have been terrifying, but they spoke to her with gentle kindness. "Woman, why are you crying?" they asked. "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." As she spoke, she turned around and saw a man standing behind her, but she did not recognize him through her tears and in the dim morning light. She assumed he was the gardener, perhaps the one person who might know what had happened to the body. "Woman, why are you crying?" the man asked, using the same words as the angels. "Who is it you are looking for?" "Sir," she said, "if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Then the man spoke just one word, but it was enough to change everything. Mary. She knew that voice, had heard it call her name 100 times before. She turned toward him fully, and through her tears she saw the impossible. Jesus himself, alive and whole, standing in the garden where he had been buried. "Rabboni!" she cried, which means teacher in Aramaic. She reached out to embrace him, to assure herself that this was not some cruel dream or vision, but Jesus gently prevented her. "Do not hold on to me," he said, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene became the first evangelist of the resurrection, running back to the disciples with news that would transform the world. "I have seen the Lord." But her testimony was met with skepticism. It seemed too good to be true, too wonderful to believe. Meanwhile, the guards at the tomb had experienced their own shocking encounter with the supernatural. Early that morning, there had been a violent earthquake, and an angel of the Lord had come down from heaven, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards had been so afraid that they shook and became like dead men. When they recovered their senses and realized what had happened, they faced a terrible dilemma. They could report the truth and risk being executed for allowing a prisoner to escape, or they could accept a bribe to keep quiet. When they went to the chief priests to report what had happened, they were offered a large sum of money to spread the story that the disciples had come during the night and stolen the body while they were sleeping. It was a story full of holes. If they had been sleeping, how could they know who had taken the body? And if they had been sleeping on duty, why weren't they being executed? But it was the best explanation the religious leaders could devise, and they promised to protect the guards if the story reached Pilate's ears. So the first lie about the resurrection was born, even as the truth was beginning to spread throughout Jerusalem. But truth has a way of proving itself, and in the days that followed, more and more people would encounter the risen Christ and discover that death truly had been conquered. Later that same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were discussing everything that had happened, their hearts heavy with disappointment and confusion. They had hoped that Jesus was the one who was going to redeem Israel, but his death had shattered their expectations. As they walked and talked, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He seemed to be just another traveler on the road, perhaps someone who had been in Jerusalem for the Passover and was now returning home. "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" he asked them. They stopped, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked in amazement, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" Jesus asked. So they told him about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. They explained how the chief priests and rulers had handed him over to be sentenced to death and had crucified him. They spoke of their dashed hopes and of the confusing reports from some women who claimed to have seen angels and to have been told that Jesus was alive. Jesus listened patiently, then began to explain to them from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. He showed them how Moses and all the prophets had spoken of the Christ's suffering and subsequent glory. As he spoke, their hearts began to burn within them, though they still did not recognize who he was. As they approached Emmaus, Jesus acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly to stay with them since it was nearly evening. So he went in to stay with them, and when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. In that moment, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. The familiar gesture, the way he blessed and broke the bread, something in his manner that was uniquely his. But even as recognition dawned, he disappeared from their sight, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. They looked at each other in amazement. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? they asked each other. Without hesitation, they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem, despite the late hour and the 7-mile journey they had just completed. They found the 11 disciples and those with them, assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two from Emmaus told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. The evidence was mounting, but it was still difficult for the human mind to accept such an extraordinary claim. While they were still talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them in the locked room where they had gathered for fear of the Jewish leaders. His sudden appearance terrified them, and they thought they were seeing a ghost. "Why are you troubled?" he asked gently. "And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." He showed them his hands and feet, bearing the marks of the nails, and his side where the spear had pierced him. The wounds that had caused his death were now the proof of his resurrection. Slowly, their terror gave way to wonder and joy, though they still could hardly believe their eyes. "Do you have anything here to eat?" Jesus asked, and they gave him a piece of broiled fish. He took it and ate it in their presence, demonstrating that he was not a spirit or hallucination, but truly alive in bodily form. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the Scriptures, showing them how everything written about him in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms had to be fulfilled. "This is what is written," he told them. "The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the 3rd day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." Over the next 40 days, Jesus appeared to his disciples many times, speaking about the kingdom of God and preparing them for the mission that lay ahead. He appeared to more than 500 believers at one time, to his brother James, who had not believed in him during his earthly ministry, and repeatedly to the 11 apostles who would carry his message to the ends of the earth. To Peter, who had denied him 3 times, Jesus offered a special restoration by the Sea of Galilee. 3 times he asked Peter if he loved him, and 3 times Peter affirmed his love, receiving the commission to feed my sheep. The failure that had seemed so devastating became the foundation for a more humble and effective ministry. Thomas, who had been absent when Jesus first appeared to the disciples, struggled with doubt until Jesus appeared again and invited him to touch the wounds in his hands and side. "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed, becoming the first person to explicitly declare Jesus' divinity after the resurrection. Each appearance served a purpose, whether to comfort the grieving, convince the skeptical, or commission the faithful. Jesus was not merely proving that he was alive. He was preparing his followers for the greatest mission in human history, the proclamation of his victory over sin and death to every nation on earth. The resurrection transformed everything. The disciples who had been hiding in fear became bold proclaimers of the gospel. The women who had wept at the cross became the first to announce the empty tomb. The followers who had lost hope discovered a hope that could never again be taken away. Death, which had seemed like the ultimate enemy, was revealed to be a defeated foe. The grave, which had appeared to be the end of the story, became the birthplace of eternal life. The cross, which had looked like the triumph of evil, was shown to be the instrument of evil's destruction. Jesus had not come merely to teach or to heal, though he had done both with unparalleled power. He had not come merely to demonstrate God's love, though that love had been displayed with breathtaking clarity. He had come to die and rise again, to pay the price for human sin, and to open the way to eternal life for all who would believe. The story that began in a stable in Bethlehem reached its climax in an empty tomb in Jerusalem. The child who had been born to save his people from their sins had grown up to become the man who would save the world from death itself. The teacher who had spoken of laying down his life for his sheep had proven that his words were not mere rhetoric, but literal truth. And so, the greatest love story ever told reached its triumphant conclusion, though it was really just the beginning. For the resurrection of Jesus was not the end, but the commencement of a new chapter in human history, one in which death would no longer have the final word, and in which hope would spring eternal in every heart that believed. The sun that rose on that first Easter morning illuminated not just the empty tomb, but the pathway to forever. The stone that had been rolled away opened not just a burial chamber, but the very gates of heaven. The voice that called Mary's name in the garden would soon be calling millions of other names, drawing them from death to life, from despair to hope, from earth to eternity. This is the story that has echoed through 20 centuries, the account that has transformed countless lives and will continue to do so until time itself comes to an end. It is the story of perfect love meeting perfect justice, of infinite mercy conquering deserved judgment, of life swallowing up death in victory. As you rest in the quietness of this night, let your heart find peace in the knowledge that this story is not merely ancient history, but living reality. The same Jesus who walked out of that tomb 2,000 years ago is alive today, offering the same forgiveness, the same hope, the same eternal life to all who will receive it. The passion has ended, but the victory continues. The cross has been endured, but the crown awaits. The battle has been fought and won, and now the celebration can begin, a celebration that will last forever, in a kingdom where there will be no more death, no more sorrow, no more crying, no more pain. For the former things will have passed away, and all things will have been made new. Rest now in the assurance that love has triumphed, that hope is justified, and that the story which seemed to end in tragedy has been revealed as the greatest comedy in the truest sense, a tale that ends not in death but in life, not in separation but in reunion, not in defeat but in victory beyond all imagining. The tomb is empty. The stone is rolled away. The victory is won. And the love that accomplished it all reaches across time and space to embrace every heart that will receive it, offering peace that passes understanding and joy that will never end.